to see if is our sound going to work? Yeah? We're going to be okay? Okay, thanks, Tom. I have so many people to thank. First, Danny at Bloomsbury Cafe, who gave us the space tonight. Let us kind of take this over. Thank you, Danny. All the folks at Bloomsbury for putting us in the front window and pushing the book. I want to thank folks, Sheila and Susan. Thank you so much. So great to do this, and I feel so much support from this community that I love, and it's great to be here tonight to celebrate this book. So, 2018. Some of you know the writer Anne Lamott, and over the last 20 years, she and I talk from time to time, usually when she's very prolific and she has a book and she has an idea that she's working on and she needs a conversation partner. And I'm one of the designated conversation partners. And so we were talking in 2018, and usually she says things like, pretend I'm a golden retriever and talk to me, like that. And so I was doing that, and she said, well, what are you up to these days? And I told her about the work of the hearth and storytelling, and she said, have you written anything? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, my wife and I have spent a long period of time trying to get some writing out about this work I'm doing. I sent it to her, and I remember she called me about an hour later and said, you have to do this, and you have to do it now, and I'm going to help you with this, and you guys need to get to work. And so Jill and I, over the next 2.5 years, started working on this book, getting the chapters right, and when we got them good enough, we sent them to Annie, and she would send me messages like, hey, I slept through the first 3 pages. Did I miss anything? Or, did you write this chapter or the Democratic National Committee? Because I can't tell. And very soft, gentle, encouraging, midwifing kind of writing coach. But eventually, we got the book where we wanted it to be. And the hope of this work is I've had this incredible privilege to work with the stories of lots of people. I counted about over 350, somewhere between 350 and 400 people in this town, and then hundreds more in other towns. And it's amazing when someone says, I want to tell my story, and they invite me into their home. We don't know each other, but we're telling this story for a larger purpose. They want to raise money for a homeless shelter. They want to develop awareness around what combat veterans are going through. They want to make sure that the children's health program has enough money. And so they want to tell this story. As you know, people don't like to speak in public, and they don't like to reveal what they've been through. But I meet one heart after another that is willing to push through that inhibition in order to serve a larger purpose. And so I'd sit in these living rooms, and people would start to tell their story, and I get to be the one to try to listen and bring it into the world. And over this decade plus of doing that work, there's this kind of sorrow, really grief, of watching how we live our days, watching how we interact with one another in these mediums that have shown up, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all this kind of stuff. And knowing that beneath those surfaces are these struggling human beings filled with longing, filled with overcoming suffering, filled with creativity that we rarely touch or feel, this language of the heart that stays beneath the surface. So the hope of this book was to somehow communicate that. And I remembering now, my wife said, don't talk too much, just start reading the book. So let me see if I can communicate that. I just want to start at the very start, at the beginning. There are moments, often unexpected, when you find yourself at home in your own life. Simple, gentle, ordinary moments, standing at the kitchen window, rain outside, the earth springing into green and yellow, the birds, the ridiculous birds, singing without worry beneath the gray sky. And for some reason, without effort, the anxiety lifts, your chest relaxes, your senses awaken, a quiet descends, and you're home. It's in moments like this when I can feel how distant I have been from the life I long to live. I have been homesick and didn't know it. I have been living miles away from my deepest yearnings and not known it. I have been hurrying through my days, isolated, fragmented, caught within the jet stream of the anxious world, and only now, in the waking stupor, do I feel the alienation and loss, and like a sobering drunk ask, how long was I out? Months is the reply. Other times, years. I used to sometimes sense in conversations with friends and the movies, books, and stories we consumed an unspoken longing for some kind of great disruption, a disaster, an upheaval, some systemic breakdown. Cell towers toppled, the internet shorted out, highways blocked, the human world forced to stop. It was a fantasy, of course, but one that revealed a kind of helpless despair at the lives we find ourselves compelled to live. It came from an unconscious understanding that our way of life was destructive and unsustainable, dishonest and unsatisfying. A longing for a reckoning and repentance. A longing for limits, an adult to come into the room and say, hey, that's enough. It was a longing for someone to end the tyranny of our every impulse, a longing that we might come to our senses, to our neighbors, to our basic needs and gifts. And then the world stopped. The pandemic hit, and we were effectively put under house arrest, masked and hand sanitized. We peered with suspicion behind locked doors at the mail carrier. The old couple walking their dog far too casually. Our own mother returning a casserole dish. Step back, mother. Don't touch the doorknob. Just leave it in the doorstep, mother. The Grim Reaper chillingly made its way through the human population, compelling all of us to not only withdraw from public spaces, but also to reflect inwardly. What's the meaning of life? What matters? Why am I living this way? Why have I wasted so much time? Several years ago, I spent 6 months living and working in northern Wales. It's a rural, ancient land layered in stories and history. The Welsh people have struggled and suffered to keep their language, and through that language, a connection to the past, to their ancestors, to the land itself. Within that language, there's a sacred Welsh word, a word, the Welsh tell me, that doesn't quite translate into English. The word is hiraeth. A wise friend from that land once told me the word refers to a particular kind of longing. What kind of longing? I asked. He paused, trying to find the words. A longing for a place or time that the soul once knew. My son Noah was living in London. He was studying acting, living in an apartment with a handful of American students from across the United States. I called and asked how he was getting along with his roommates. He told me it wasn't easy to connect to the other students because they spent much of their time by themselves on their phones, on social media, and when they didn't socialize with one another, when they did socialize, it often involved heavy drinking. Then he said, all of them are full of longing, but they don't know what they're longing for. And they don't even know that they're longing. He could have been describing most of us in the West, overwhelmed, estranged from our lives, out of touch with our inner vitality. We often find ourselves entranced by activities that we know are empty and damaging. We're longing, but we don't know why. We're yearning for a life we once knew, but we can't seem to remember where we left it. 2 weeks later, I called Noah, asked how it was going. He told me he had invited his roommates to go with him to a farmer's market. Together they bought chicken and vegetables, apples, lemons, fresh herbs. They spent the rest of the day cooking a fall soup, garlic potatoes, beet salad, roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, apples baked in butter and cinnamon. Eager to share the feast they had made, Noah and his roommates called the students from the apartment next door, invited them over. They lit candles. They gathered leaves and flowers for the table. When the guests arrived, Noah asked everyone to set their phones aside. We took our time, he told me. We sat at the table for hours just talking, telling stories about our families, the towns we grew up in, our hopes for the future. He paused. We sat late into the night until early morning just talking. Everyone was so tired, but no one wanted to leave. Although he didn't say it, my guess is that around that table the longing momentarily ceased, the emptiness filled, the anxiety calmed, Within those hours, rich with story and laughter and human warmth, 8 university students found home. What does it mean to be human? How are we to spend our days? How do we face the troubles of this world? How do we address the heartache for the life we're meant to live but can't remember how? How do we find the place that the soul once knew? So I want to take a moment to just move from these words and this focus on the book to us. And I want to invite you to remember, just as that little story of Noah's meal with his friends, remember a meal. Just let it come up into your memory. Some meal, some gathering around food that was special to you, that was connecting, that was maybe even sacred to you. Maybe it was 2 cheeseburgers with somebody on your way driving home from college, and you sat outside a McDonald's and told your stories to each other. Maybe it was that first night after your first child was born, eating in a hospital room. Maybe it was a particular Christmas with all the relatives gathered in your home. Or a morning at your grandmother's house when she made those pancakes and was curious about your life. Why don't you just take a moment, just within your own library, to draw forth some meal, just like these people in this reading I just expressed, mattered to you, where you came home to yourself. What did you see in that moment? And what did you hear? And what did it feel like to be in that space? And I want to invite you, just if you feel drawn to it, to say a word or a sentence out loud that kind of expresses what that was like, if you feel like it. And we'll just do it popcorn style. Say it out loud.
Connected.
Connected.
Joy.
Joy.
Fun.
Safe. Fun.
Warmth.
A warmth. A sense of love.
Sad.
Sad.
Interested.
Interested.
Sensory.
Sensory. All the senses.
Investment.
There's an investment.
Strawberries.
Strawberries.
Together.
Together.
Family.
Family. Yeah.
Ideas.
Ideas. Right.
Laughter.
Laughter.
Alive. Alive.
Alive.
Friendship.
Friendship.
Inspired.
Inspired. Yeah, the spirit rises to the surface. Yeah. This is the wealth of human experience that lives in all of us, right? So the German mystic and writer Meister Eckhart once said, all of us are sacred books. And you feel some of those stories and some of those experiences of our lives that are translucent with love and life and curiosity and ideas. But we rarely live there, right? We stay down beneath the surface. We don't stay down beneath the surface. And when we do, we become more curious about others instead of dismissive. So one of the things I experience in this work is when I work with people in their stories, whether for public events or for private work, it's like everyone has a coming out story. right? Everyone has a story where they want to tell you something that it's remained hidden in them for a long time. And often I do my work, I call it the work of a story catcher, where I'm trying to draw the story forth. And my experience has been when people come to my house, they tell me a story, but the real story waits out in the car. And then once they feel I'm safe, then they tell me the real story. And we get down into the story that they long to tell. And so I have a chapter in here called The Coming Out Parade, because it is just a time and time again people telling me their story of claiming their racial identity, or claiming some suffering they've been through, or claiming some gift that everyone has ignored and they want to bring to the surface. And at the end of the chapter, if I tell the stories of these different people I've helped sort of midwife to get those stories out and the way it's changed me, I have this little passage at the end that begins at our own Southern Oregon Pride Parade. And it goes like this. Every fall, the Southern Oregon Pride Parade is held in our town, and like most pride parades across the globe, the event is full of color and music to celebrate and promote equality for our LGBTQ people. Each year, the part of the parade I find most moving is the presence of the families. Old and young couples, parents, children, and extended relatives holding hands, walking together, often without a float or a fancy car or loud music. It's the most humble part of the parade. My neighbors, colleagues, friends, and acquaintances walk down the street to let others know, this is my family. This is who I am. I'm glad to be who I am. Every once in a while, someone in the parade will see me, and we'll both shout and wave vigorously. In no other setting do I behave this excitedly when encountering my neighbors. Never have I walked into a grocery store, noticed Evelyn standing in the checkout line, and then begun yelling and waving both arms in the air as if she were standing on the deck of the Queen Mary. Evelyn! Yeah, Evelyn! Woohoo! Bon voyage! But the parade is a community ritual, a public righting of wrongs. It's an invitation for all of us in this town to claim and celebrate our common humanity. So I do my part. I stand on the sidewalk, and when Evelyn and her family parade down the street, I try to meet their eyes. I call out and wave wildly until we both feel seen and recognized. I've often wondered what would happen if our community held a coming out parade the next day. An invitation would be extended to everyone who feels unseen, hidden, trapped within a demeaning storyline. Like the Pride Parade, there would be an atmosphere of acceptance and welcome. We'd have music, maybe a band that contains all the uncelebrated instruments, the flugelhorn, the shofar, the saw. Local townsfolk would walk down the street, each one holding a sign claiming without shame an unrecognized aspect of their identity. I cry often. I'm an artist. I'm bipolar. I dance naked a lot. I'm a woman who doesn't want children. I'm afraid to get old. I'm smart. I don't exercise. I'm depressed. I survived abuse. I love animals more than people. I miss my mother. The rest of the town would line the sidewalks, scanning faces, reading signs, cheering, waving, and from time to time, running out to welcome those who are trying to get free. So I want to, again, I really want to work this into the soil every time I read one of these chapters. I like doing stuff with people more than just standing up here reading any of these words. And so, what is something about you that few people know? Something about you that if you had a sign, you'd write it on a sign maybe. Something that you might feel comfortable telling other people in this setting, so don't choose the big, deep, vulnerable thing that's going to cause everyone to be awkward and then slowly leave the room. But something about you that most people don't know. And I'm just going to invite you right now to turn to one other person and just tell them something you feel okay telling someone that's true about you that most people don't really know. Okay, so I invite you to just turn to someone and just tell them something about you that is not common knowledge, that others may not know. What's it like to hear these secrets from other people? You like it? Well, as many of you know, and I see a lot of familiar faces, you know, we've had these gatherings here since 2010 called The Hearth. And The Hearth started, I was working for a place called the Center for Engaged Compassion down in Claremont, California, living up here, and two colleagues and I were trying to figure out a set of practices that would help people cultivate compassion. And we were using Western religious sensibilities for that. And one of the questions came up by the funders of this work: how would you help a whole town? What could you do that would help a whole town become compassionate? And this question was given to me. And I was like, well, story can do this. You know, story is a natural practice. It's a folk medicine that we all know how to do. And when we tell stories to one another, if we're willing to listen and give ourselves over to the story, our hearts naturally soften and feel empathy for the teller. And so we started these events. Well, in the book, I tell the story of that work and how it evolved and the thinking behind it. And I also share what the very first night was like. And so I want to read that to you now in 2010. This is good practice. You know, tomorrow we go to the coast and we hit libraries. This is our very first book night, and then the book actually releases on Tuesday. And where do you want to be when your book comes out? You want to be in Brookings at the Chetco Library. So on Tuesday, when many of you are enjoying yourselves here in Ashland, I'll be at the Chetco Library with two other people. I didn't know there was a book reading, and they're looking for some quiet.
Are you going north from there or south?
Yeah, north. Then I go to Gold Beach, and then we go to
When
North
are you
Bend.
in Gold Beach?
Gold Beach on Wednesday.
Have to ask. Thank you.
On Wednesday, yeah.
You need to recruit at least 20.
Yeah,
I might be able to get you a couple, three.
great. And then we go to Bandon, and they were so excited they've rented out a whole 300-seat theater. So that's really going to be lonely when the two people show up to that library, to that theater. Okay, so before you do something well, you have to do it badly. Enter the first hearth gathering. The speaker system sounded like a child's radio. People wanted drinks, but there was only one waitress, and she was in a bad mood. The pub was overcrowded, causing the manager to send people outside because of fire code. Eventually, he became so nervous about breaking the law that he just left and went home. It was a cold February night in Oregon, but the people outside wouldn't leave. Instead, they propped open doors and windows so they could hear. This made the room freezing, which caused the people indoors to occasionally shout, "Close the goddamn door." At the center of the room was a group of bikers, cyclists actually, who'd been drinking for a couple of hours and were irritated by the crowd. When I stepped up to the microphone to welcome the audience, these cyclists began to heckle. "Shut the hell up!" They were blunt, lacked cleverness. We had invaded their bar and they were irritated. I stood and spoke my introductions into the muted microphone. "Welcome to the Hearth. Tonight we present real stories by regular folks. 6 brave souls, 6 local community members have volunteered to tell a true love story, told in first person in 10 minutes without notes." "Fuck you!" There was a lanky cyclist in his mid-70s, and he shook his middle finger at me. His buddies cheered. I continued talking about the local food bank, the evening's beneficiary. My mouth was praising the food bank, but my mind was working on a solution to the hecklers. How could I quiet these drunken men in neon spandex? How could I possibly win them over? I began shouting into the microphone, "This is Valentine's Day, a day we celebrate that most elusive and sought-after human experience. Each one of us hopes to find some human heart, some caring soul, some warm body, so overwhelmed with attraction that they're willing to fondle our genitalia." I paused. The bicyclists in their short-billed hats were thrown for a moment and then erupted in cheers. Sheep without a shepherd, my grandfather always said. Sheep without a shepherd. Mr. Middlefinger gave me the thumbs up as if to say, "You're all right, man. You're all right." The room quieted. After the cheers, the men turned their heads and gave me a chance. People leaned forward to hear. "So the theme tonight is love," I continued. "Every one of us, every beating heart comes into the world seeking some kind of warmth and acceptance, some kind of embrace, some kind of reconciliation. Is there anything we suffer more than the lack of love? Love is the greatest pleasure. Love is the deepest pain. Tonight, 6 neighbors will help us explore this most treasured of all human experiences." Amid the crackle of the kitchen fryer, the clink and scrape of people eating and customers calling for drinks, the storytellers spoke their particular truths into the microphone. Their stories were more confession than performance. Each person stood and humbly offered a piece of their life, and within the vulnerability of each story, we recognized ourselves and our own struggle for love. That was down at the old Caldera pub when it was down by the creek.
Oh, yeah.
Little space there, yeah. So the book then moves, at that point I talk about the hearth, and then I tell some of the public work I've done with stories, working with undocumented citizens, working with folks who are trying to help us heal climate change or address it or acclimate to it, around the tragedy of the shooting in Roseburg at Umpqua Community College, and how I've used stories in sort of these larger settings. It goes from the personal to this sort of public move. But I want to give you a chance. I was told I need to actually give everybody a chance to ask questions if they have them or of the book, and I'm happy to answer anything. And then I'll close with a little final image, and we'll do a book signing inside the air conditioning. Yeah, for those who want to say, yeah.
Now is the question.
Sure, yeah.
So what maybe was your most memorable story from one of the storytellers?
My most memorable story?
Yeah, the one that
Different
touched
storytellers?
you the most.
Well, I mean, first of all, I have many. There's a story I tell in the book, and I don't tell all of this, but it was tales from childhood. And I had a man who lives here, and he's given me permission to tell this story and to use his name and all that, Sean. And Sean said, I need to tell this story. And so I said, okay. We set a time to meet. I showed up to the coffee shop. I waited for an hour. He didn't show. I wrote him and said, hey, I was there. He said, yeah, I know you were there. I saw you. I was in my car. I couldn't come inside. So I said, well, you don't have to do this. He says, I have to do this. Can you set another time? We set a second time. I was in a church. I waited at the church about a half hour. He didn't show. I wrote him. He said, I know. I kept driving around the block. I couldn't go in. I said, Sean, you don't have to do this. We're just raising money for a children's health program. We got other people tell stories. Please give me one more chance. I showed up at the same church, waited about 30 minutes. He didn't come in. I went outside. He was sitting in his car. So I knocked on the car window, went inside. I said, what's going on? He said, I have to tell this story, and I don't want to tell it. Tell me the story. The story was, grew up in New York, Irish father, Puerto Rican mother, loved his family, big Catholic family, went to a Catholic school next door, and 3 nights a week, the whole family would clean the church. His mother was in charge of cleaning the church. And he said, all of us would go in there, we felt so special. We got a key to the church. Nobody else is in there, just us. First thing we do is go through all the pews and pick up all the garbage and look for loose change and things like that. And then Mom would put towels on our feet and we'd skate to smooth the floors and all this stuff. And we loved it, and we weren't ashamed of it. 6th grade, 12 years old, he sees his friend Nick passing out invitations to a birthday party. And Nick doesn't give him one. And he's known Nick his whole life. And he says, hey, you didn't give me an invitation. And Nick says, that's because you're and he says a racial slur for Puerto Ricans. And he doesn't know what it means. Sean doesn't know what it means. He said, I don't know. What are you talking about? And he says it again, and he finally realizes there's something cruel is being said to me. Kids start laughing. He punches this kid. He's kicked out of school. He goes home, middle of the day. His mother's like, what are you doing here? And he tells his mother what was said to him. And he says, what I'll never forget is the fear on her face. She just went white. And she sat down and she said, you need to tell everybody you're Spanish. You're not Puerto Rican, you're Spanish. I came from Spain. You tell everybody you're Spanish. And so he starts lying about his identity. He has blue eyes, kind of darker skin. People can't tell what his ethnicity is. As he gets older, he decides to, it's this very tricky thing. He tells people he's Italian, but the way he does it is he wears Italian shirts. He has all the Godfather movies at his house. He goes in the military. People say, what are you? They can't tell his ethnicity. And he would use an Italian phrase. Ah, you're Italian. He said, I never told anybody I was Italian, but I let everybody believe I was, including when he came to this town. He let everybody know he was Italian. The kids he worked with in Little League programs, the people he taught, he didn't want anybody to know, and he's in his mid-30s when he shares this story. So we work on the story. We do the night. It was at the UCC church, the Peace Church there on Siskiyou. I see him sitting in the back. I thought he wasn't going to show up. He gets up, tells from childhood. He tells the whole story. He's very emotional through the whole thing. And as many of you have been there, everybody was really gentle. Like, shh, take your time. It's okay. He finally gets to the end of the story. And he says, I want to say something that I've never said before. My name is Sean Gallagher. I'm Puerto Rican. And I remember everyone standing up and applauding him as he just fell apart and walked through and left that building. That's the story that I still remember. That's sort of coming out. Yeah.
One of my favorite parts of the book, there's all of the ones you mentioned so far, but that one when it reminded me of teenagers, when you were going to that group and they assigned you to a group of people that you had to listen to their stories, and you were looking at all the other people and thinking, these people look much cooler than the group I'm assigned.
Yes.
These are these old people, but and you were the youngest person in the group?
Yeah, so a lot of in the book is my own personal story and my own struggles and my relationship with my father and other things like that. And this was a training program. I was in my 20s. It's a training in spiritual direction, which is a practice that comes out of the Catholic tradition, and it's about contemplative listening. And the Morton Kelsey, the man who ran that, the very first day he put us in life story groups. He believed that every retreat that anybody ever did in the world should start with life story groups, and he really believed in this. And you spent a whole day in a small group with 7 or 8 people, and each person got a half hour to 45 minutes to tell their life story, and you just listened. And I was 26 years old. I was the youngest person there by about 10 years at the time. And I went to my small group room and I looked and saw who the people were. And remember when you were 26, and I was like, this is the dullest, worst group. I do not want to be a whole day listening to these people in this group. So I immediately found the facilitator and said, hey, these people aren't really my age. I think I should go to another group. And of course, at that time, I heard someone else in another group saying, anybody ready to hear Tales from the Kama Sutra? Because you're going to hear them tonight. And I'm like, that's the group that I was meant to be in. So all this amazing laughter and all this stuff, and I'm with these people who look like me, the way I look now. Like a middle-aged guy who's worried about his retirement. And so that's what happened. And then I sat in that group, and of course they started telling their stories, and I was just in shock at what people had lived and survived, and who they are, and their creativity, and their sense of humor in the midst of despair. And it absolutely transformed how I walked out of that room. I remember just like slowly looking through my town going, everybody has a story, just like these normal folks I had been with for the day. Yeah. Yes, neighbor.
Howdy, neighbor. So what is between the listening and the telling?
Right. So There's a lot of work and a lot of arguments to get this title, but there's a lot of ways we use story right now. So Stanford, you can get a master's degree in storytelling. You can get one at Harvard. These are all in the business department. There's over 100,000 marketers that call themselves storytellers, right? So we're using story in a lot of ways right now. But what between the listening and the telling is this sacred space where heart meets heart. And so what I've learned is, in the storytelling events we do, what's most important is the listening, or whether in small groups or in large groups. If the listeners are willing to share the gift of their presence, then the story shows up. And it's this exchange of gifts. I'm going to be here, I'm going to look at you, I'm going to listen. And then the teller says, okay, I'm going to share a little piece of my life with you. And the story is that transaction in between where we meet. And so to me, story is a relational practice. Story is about relationship. And that relationship takes a listener, a teller, and the story in between. And we put listening first because that's the most important part. As soon as I see people looking at their watches or their phones, the story dies. But if you listen strong enough, I am also listening. Even though my mouth's moving and the story's coming out, I'm sitting next to you going, isn't this amazing? Isn't this incredible what I've been through? Yes, it is. We're both kind of a witness to it. But that takes setting a listening environment. Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit about the development of the heart? I mean, like, I was there maybe the second time.
You were there at the second one, yeah.
And I've watched it come to many, I'm kind of curious, like, where are you now with this organization? And who's doing some of the work? You can't do it all yourself.
Yeah, well, so the Hearth has been about building community, and using story as this primary folk practice. So we have these public events that we've done here for a long time until the coronavirus, and we did one not long ago. But we started taking that practice into other spaces. So using it in Talent Phoenix High School with the kids, a third of who had been affected by fires, putting them in circles to tell stories as a kind of a social emotional care method to help kids that's not in a therapeutic setting that's sort of clinical and there's the therapist and here's me, but in a social environment they could share stories in a way that would reduce their anxiety. We had an evaluator look at that. We set up a compassionate listening team, and Kalika here was on that team, and we started finding ways to listen to people and ask questions that would allow them to share their experience. So we've been doing a lot of different projects like that. And the thing I'm most excited about is I've been training other community builders. So every year we do this thing called the Certificate in Community Storytelling. And right now we've been doing it online, but we'll be doing it in person next year. And there's people who work in juvenile detention. They're environmental activists. They're city planners. All kinds of different community builders who want to learn how to use story to repair relationships in the arena they work in.
Going to keep the Hearth going?
Yeah, this year, actually, we're going to do one event on September 22nd that's going to be focused on this book, and I won't read so much, I'll tell more stories, and we'll have music there. Then, my good friend, Danielle Mancuso, who's generous enough to come here tonight, who's sitting in the back with his partner, Erica. Danielle runs the Lantern, which is just a really fun story night. If you've never been, it's at the Black Sheep. I think your next one's in September. September 18th. It's a different format. It's open mic kind of storytelling. You can get up there and tell a story if you want to. Put your name in a hat, you get chosen. Or you can write your story. For this, she calls it the Introvert Special. And you write your story out and you put it in a basket, and if it gets chosen, it gets read. Then I think they all get chosen. Yeah.
They make magic.
Yeah. So Danielle is just another one of the bright stars of this community, and she's going to facilitate the Hearth gatherings with her own pizzazz, her own creativity, which is cool, starting November 3rd, I think, somewhere around there. So those will happen throughout the year. So thank you, Danielle. Okay, one last question.
You mentioned the awkwardness of being in a group where you're separated in age by the other people you see in the group.
Yeah.
Have you had opportunities to try to intentionally have the young speak to their elders or the elders speak to the young and break through those cross-generational awkward situations?
Yes, in fact, I just did, the question was about, do you ever bring people cross-generationally, young and old? And I've done events where we had 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds and teenagers and, retirees in a room. And I just did an event. There's a place called this, we should all know this here in this valley where we can be sometimes very focused on ourselves. Anybody heard of the 5 Friendly Towns? No. We're only about an hour from them. And they're just outside of Klamath Falls, 5 little towns. They call themselves the 5 Friendly Towns. A couple of them are on the California side, like Tule Lake and Doris and Maupin and Bonanza. These towns have, and so I went out there and worked with the high schools, all brought kids in, and we talked about how to listen to stories from older folks in their town. And then I said, let's go out and get a bunch. So we got older folks in the town, brought them in as part of the training, and they collected stories from those people. And what I can tell you is young people are starving for that kind of real interaction where you're going to tell me the truth about what you've lived, because as they're moving into adulthood, they don't know that we don't know anything, that we're still struggling or that we're still got questions. And instead of advice, it's such a relief for them to hear the real struggles of adults. And so I found young people love these kinds of settings. If there's brackets and rules so the old folks don't talk too much and the young people get a chance to speak and you set it up right, they can be really life-giving. Yeah. Okay, well, hey, thank you, everyone. This is such a nice way to kick off the tour. I want to end with one thing here. Padraig Otoma, who's a Irish poet, has this little, I guess it's a poem. He's a poet, but he calls it a prayer for reconciliation. It kind of captures what I feel like is the heart of this book. So I'll just close with this. Then I'm going to go inside, sit at a table if people want to get their books signed. Bloomsbury said they'll be downstairs if you want to purchase a book, or if you grab one on your way, make sure you buy it before you leave. Okay, a prayer for reconciliation. Where there is separation, there is pain. And where there's pain, there's a story. And where there's a story, there is understanding and misunderstanding, listening and not listening. May we, separated peoples, estranged strangers, unfriended families, divided communities, turn toward each other and turn toward our stories with understanding and listening, with argument and acceptance, with challenge, change, and consolation. Because if God is to be found, God will be found in the space between.